It's that time of year again, and we're talking about how to invest in the chip industry. And if you haven't watched any of our 2025 series, we did top semiconductor stocks for 2025, the EDA portion of the industry. We did a little deep dive on the IP section and also in memory IDMs. And so today we're going to kick off 2026 by talking about data center networking, optical, and silicon photonics, which is quite a big subject.
It spans IDMs, the old semiconductor industry business model. It spans fabless designers. We're even going to talk a little bit about the upstream and downstream part of the supply chain.
This is only one small slice of what we discuss in full while we're on Semi Insider. We have a new research platform that highlights all of these topics, all of our research. We have live events. Check us out over on chipstockinvestor.com.
The full write-up that this video is based off of is, of course, available over on chipstockinvestor.com. So if you have any questions, that is where you will find the answers. Let's dive into it. Let's talk about AI data center networking. This is a very large part of the market, one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing part of the market, part of the whole AI supercycle.
Look out for these key points. What are networking chips and how do these companies that make networking chips make money? There's multiple different kinds of networking chips and their components. The network is the computer, and who's who in this massive market. We'll start with this slide because this is a great way to illustrate networking. Networking is like the roads, the freeways, the interchanges that are part of the computing system that transport data from the user. The data center gets that data where it needs to go.
You could think of it like your commute to work. The logic chip is like your office or your place of business where you get the work done, and your commute to work is like the network. Here's a look at the network, the backside of a bunch of data center servers with cables plugged into them that transport the data from chip to chip, from server to server, from the storage part of the data center to logic, also controls traffic into and out of the data center as well.
And you've seen this slide, I think, many times before. The main parts of a computing system: logic, networking, and storage. And networking fits right in the middle there because it moves data between logic, storage, all of these different places. There's two main types: copper and fiber optic. Copper carries the on and off pulses of electrons to formulate binary code, zeros and ones, versus fiber optic, which pulses light, which creates those binary codes.
Yeah, copper is for shorter distances. Fiber optic is for interconnecting parts of the data center over longer distances, up to even exceeding 100 meters. But let's talk about the market overall. We have this listed here in the upper left-hand corner. When we're talking about actual end market sales of the semiconductors themselves, there's a little bit of a goofy labeling thing going on here. We're going to lump all of this together as logic, even though the networking chips are distinctly different chip type from logic, like a CPU or a GPU. Technically speaking, a lot of these switching chips actually are performing a logic function, even though the function itself is very different from what a CPU or a GPU will handle. In total, logic sales had a massive 2025, 20% plus growth rate, and it's expected to happen again in 2026, approaching nearly 400 billion in end market sales for these things, according to WSTS. So perhaps reaching that $1 trillion end market sales figure a few years earlier than expected. But this is where we're at in this market overall. These networking chips are big business because it helps interconnect these GPUs or XPUs, Google's TPUs all together and get them working in tandem with each other.
WSTS breaks that down even further into various types of chips. Optoelectronics, they're in blue, which we're going to be focusing on a bit today, as well as analog and orange. Green is logic. For logic chips, as Nick mentioned, nearly 300 billion this year, expected to be closer to 400 billion next year. Analog, over 85 billion, expected to be 91 billion next year. And then that optoelectronics, a little bit smaller, just over 42 billion this year, but expected to be over 45 billion.
Let's talk about some of these different components. And specifically, we're going to talk about the different businesses for each of these segments within what a network comprises. So we're going to be talking about the cables themselves, both copper and fiber optic. The light sources, obviously that would be specifically for a fiber optic cable, laser beams, converters, clocking and timing retimers, lots of other stuff here. Analog to digital converters would be specific to copper. There's also similar that happens with fiber optic. You need some way to translate the pulses of electrons or the pulses of light into ones and zeros, into digital binary code. Transceivers, that's the assembly itself on either end of the cable. We talk about switching, network interfaces, and then the whole network is the computer thing. Let's start with the cable itself, which is not a semiconductor exactly, but obviously a very important component that has semiconductors attached to it at both ends. Who makes the actual copper and fiber optic cable?
Well, there's a number of companies that do this, but one that you may be familiar with is Amphenol. That's one that we've talked about pretty substantially here at CSI. And they're acquiring CommScope. They announced that acquisition earlier this year. Some other notable ones, Corning, Sumitomo. We've covered Nexans. Why do you have that one circled?
This one's based in France, and they've actually done a lot of very small regional acquisitions. Interesting little business. It might be one that you're interested in, especially if you're based in Europe. I don't want to draw too much comparison to Amphenol, but a similar operating method there where they're buying smaller businesses, a lot of family-owned, privately held businesses, especially in copper cable. But the big one amongst all of these is, of course, Corning, and then Amphenol buying most of CommScope's business. As you may know from our recent write-ups on this, Amphenol is buying most of what remains of CommScope, the cable and assembly business, especially for fiber optic. And then what will remain from CommScope is called Ruckus Networks. Corning's another interesting one. Pretty lame business to be invested in overall up until this year when suddenly everyone wants lots of cable. And Corning is a top supplier of that, especially fiber optic materials with their performance and technology glass products.
Let's talk about the light sources. Fiber optic cables need lasers, light sources, and laser manufacturers. There's been a lot of consolidation in this market. Two big ones, Coherent and Lumentum, are both IDMs for all intents and purposes. Broadcom also has a segment for this, which we'll look at in just a moment.
Yeah, they are IDMs, Coherent and Lumentum. Similar dynamic to what's happened in the memory chip market. A lot of the IDMs have consolidated down to just a few players. Coherent and Lumentum, I think still to this day, a lot of investors don't realize Broadcom is actually not completely fabless. That's why on the Discord server, we have in parentheses, mostly fabless semiconductor designers. Most of what Broadcom does is fabless, but they also have some proprietary manufacturing. On either end of these cables is a transceiver. If you rip open the transceiver, there's lots of parts and pieces and components inside of them. And for a fiber optic cable, a main component is the light source from a laser. So Coherent and Lumentum, the two biggest ones.
And so, as we mentioned, a little consolidation. Here's what's been the recent history for Coherent. They were initially going to merge with Lumentum. This was back in 2021, but then they decided to cancel that merger and actually merge with II-VI in 2022. And so Lumentum has continued on its own, also done some acquisitions.
And you might be wondering about these two because both of these stocks have done very well in 2025, especially Lumentum, still at this point up over 200% this year. Of the two, it's been a faster growing business, but it's more focused on these data center networking products, while Coherent is much more diversified. And when we did the Coherent discussion, I think last year when Jim Anderson joined Coherent, we talked about one of the primary goals there was to simplify Coherent's business. And so as a result, it's been slower growing, but there's a lot of room there, we think, for Coherent to clean up the business, increase profit margins, and also, of course, get a bit of growth from the data center segment. So that would be kind of like the value play among these two companies. Lumentum, much more growth and momentum play right now.
And then here's a note from Broadcom, some of their products, and the little note at the bottom about their manufacturing facilities, which is why we say they're not completely fabless. They have some there in Colorado, Singapore, and Pennsylvania.
And specifically the INP, indium phosphide, and gallium arsenide, you'll see those compound semiconductors also discussed if you read up on Coherent and Lumentum. So technically, Broadcom is actually the third IDM, integrated device manufacturer, to round out the top three in this market for laser light sources.
You may be familiar with retimers, PCIe timers, Labs, Credo, Texas Instruments, Marvell, Broadcom.
There's a good mix on this slide of both the older industry business model, the IDM model, like Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, both leaders in a lot of this stuff. Analog to digital converter, that's another little chip that you'll find within those transceivers. You need some way to convert the on-off pulses of either electricity, of electrons, or of light. You need a way to convert that back into ones and zeros. And then also, conversely, when the transceiver is sending signal to another location of the data center, you also need a way to convert the ones and zeros to pulses of electrons or light. TI and ADI, both key companies there, as are with these other things, clocking and timing. We have SciTime listed there. We did a write-up on them last year, and that's still here on the Discord server and in the web app. Microchip, a big player here. So there's a lot of little parts and pieces basically to make this all work. But let's go over retimers again, because this is a key niche that's been carved out.
So a retimer receives a degraded data signal, recovers that data, clocks the signal, and then retransmit the clean data, a fresh copy of the data and the clock to the next cable. And we like to illustrate this by a relay race, like a runner handing off the baton to the next runner, helping that data continue to flow.
The previous runner gets tired, hands it off to the teammate. This has been a really key product the last couple of years. It's helped Astera Labs and Credo really take off in creating what's called active electrical cables. It's a way to extend the useful length of copper cable. Typically, data transmitted over copper begins to degrade after just a few meters due to various factors. And you don't necessarily want to use fiber optic for short runs. Those cables can be expensive relative to copper. They can also consume more power. So a nice, effective, total cost of ownership alternative are created by some of these chip types that extend the usefulness of copper, also use some usefulness in fiber optic as well, and cleaning up signal, reclocking it. With Astera, they began to extend their portfolios with some acquisitions. They have a partnership with Allchip in building some custom silicon, custom network infrastructure. And then, of course, Credo, they made this small acquisition of a design team working on micro LED. So that would be different than a laser light source. That would be LED, light emitting diode, as a light source for cable. Another potentially cost-effective type of cable, networking type that could be used before a hyperscaler or a data center operator decides to make the jump to a longer run, more expensive fiber optic cable.
And then finally, we have that acquisition of Celestial AI by Marvell for the photonic fabric technology.
Let's round it out. Let's talk about now the transceiver. We've talked about some of the components inside the transceiver. Then you have the companies that overall design and also manufacture the transceivers, the whole assembly that goes on either end of the cable. And obviously, there's going to be some overlap here with the companies we just talked about, Coherent and Lumentum, not just manufacturers of the lasers and light sources, but also the transceivers overall. That's a hallmark of an IDM business. They design products, they make the wafers, and then they make the final product. Maybe we should start with Nvidia. Did you know that Nvidia has a transceiver design business? They got this from Mellanox when they acquired Mellanox in early 2020. They have those cables and transceivers both for InfiniBand and also now for Ethernet as well.
And then Jabil as well.
Yeah, this is a business they had before. Intel also had a transceiver business, but a couple of years ago, they divested that to Jabil. And now Intel is primarily focused on integrated photonics, silicon photonics. So they're working specifically on the chips, also doing some work on co-packaged optics. AMD also does some design work here. And the manufacturing is handled in part by that company Sanmina. That's who they offloaded the ZT Systems manufacturing business to. And in exchange, AMD owns equity. They got some cash and also some equity, some stock in Sanmina in exchange. So if you own AMD, you get a bonus investment.
Now on to switching and routing and network interface. And this is kind of where lines get even more blurry.
Microchip actually has chip switching business, but the really big ones here are also the big network designers and network builders. So Nvidia, Broadcom, AMD, Marvell, Intel trying to get into this game. And then the network system designers and builders, Broadcom, Nvidia, the two really big ones. And then here you also start to get some overlap with the companies that sometimes handle some of the design and manufacturing for a company like Nvidia or AMD, Dell, HP, Enterprise, Cisco, Supermicro, Lenovo, Arista. Some of the outsourced manufacturing companies like Celestica, they're at the bottom, also kind of getting into this part of the market. And you also start getting into system level software from many of these companies too.
This is an intense slide with a lot of companies trying to get in. If they weren't already in, they're getting into this market right now. The enterprise, cloud computing, connecting all of this accelerated computing infrastructure.
Some of these companies have carved out a niche for themselves, like Allchip, a niche player within custom silicon doing some design work for Amazon, or Astera Labs and Credo have carved out kind of a niche and are working at trying to dominate that niche within the whole network. Data center network is the entire computer thing. And those can be great investments if those companies find that niche and then really dominate what they do. They really turn themselves into clear-cut leaders. On the other end of the spectrum, you have some of these big companies that have gotten really broad. And as a result, they're able to wield incredible control over their supply chain. Like Nvidia, as Jensen frequently calls it, they're a full stack computing company now. They're not just designing chips, they're designing entire systems. They're also helping design software that runs on those systems. And as a result, because they're in so many parts of the supply chain, they can wield great control over their suppliers, get favorable pricing on those parts, and grow their profit on a per share basis. Now, if you're wondering where should you start in investing in these and the other businesses that we've talked about in this presentation, you want to look for those companies that have found a niche, have vision and focus, and are leading technologically in translating that into profitable growth. And then on the other end of the spectrum, some of those companies eventually can turn themselves into broader based supply chain controllers. Like Nvidia, it used to be more of a niche company. They started out dominating the GPU market for high-end video game graphics and professional visualization, engineering, design, and architectural design, movie, CGI, graphics. And eventually they turn themselves into something much greater than that. Those are the two ends of the spectrum that you should think about in terms of investing, but a lot changing now because of the accelerated computing supercycle Nvidia kicked off. And now this is gradually turning into something much greater. This is much more than just the hyperscalers buying Nvidia products to accelerate their internal workloads, their back-end data center work. To continue to make accelerated computing work for more companies, you need more custom infrastructure. And so that's why the bull market is gradually expanding to more of these other businesses.
We have more discussion on this topic and everything semiconductor over on chipstockinvestor.com. You can get access to a Semiconductor Insider membership and our research platform where we discuss all things chip stocks. If you have any questions about the industry or want to add these companies to your portfolio but don't know where to start, the research platform offers some great tools. Check it out, chipstockinvestor.com. See you soon. Take care, everybody.